I am a huge, huge fan of political TV shows, both of the dramatic variety.
The road to power is paved with hypocrisy.
And of the comedic variety.
I'm a white trash cracker from a white trash town.
And one thing that always really, really interests me is the portrayal of political strategy on shows like this. There's this trope of a character, like a politician or a statesman, that is so adept, they're so clairvoyant, they can predict their opponent's moves with such precision and such accuracy that they can think like 5 moves in advance, 10 moves in advance, and just straight up embarrass their opponents at every turn. And it got me thinking, if I were to pick one instance from the political history that I'm aware of that best sort of encapsulates this spirit of political skullduggery, what would that one instance be? And I'm not talking from like a salacious murder affair standpoint. I'm talking about from just a purely strategic standpoint. Is there a political story from our history where the strategy and tactics lives up to, or in fact exceeds, the stuff that you might see on a show like Game of Thrones? And the answer is, of course, yes, and I'm really, really excited to share it with you guys. Lyndon Johnson was selected to be the Senate Minority Leader for the Democrats in 1953. Now, this was a huge accomplishment because Lyndon Johnson was the youngest person ever appointed to this position. But at the same time, the position also carried with it a huge set of problems. You see, at the time, there were 2 wings of the Democratic Party. This is a long time ago. But there was the Southern Bloc and the Northern Bloc. And the Northern Bloc of the Democratic Party had a lot of power nationally. That's where all the presidents came from. But the Southern Bloc reigned supreme in the Senate. And it was the Southern Bloc that Johnson curried favor with in order to get his position. Now, it's really important to understand just how much power the South had in the Senate and how they got it. When the US Senate first started out, every senator would discuss every bill, but as the country, the issues that it dealt with and its scope expanded, the strategy of everyone talking to everyone about everything proved pretty much impossible to sustain. And so in 1816, the Senate came up with the idea to divide itself up into committees that were based on topic. So there'd be a committee on, say, agriculture or labor, and each committee would discuss topic-specific proposals and then make a recommendation to the whole Senate. And to give you a sense of just how powerful the Southern Democrats were at this point, note that they had the leadership position. In other words, they were the chairman of the committees on banking and currency, foreign relations, appropriations, armed services, finance, government operations, forestry, and agriculture. Even the committee on the post office and the civil service was run by Southern Democrats. So Southern Democrats managed to gain all this power in the Senate because the Senate observes this ironclad hierarchy called the seniority system. What this means is that the power of a senator is pretty much governed entirely by how long they have spent in the Senate. In other words, their seniority. So, for instance, who gets to be on a committee? Let's say a lot of senators want the same seat on a committee. Who gets to be on it? Well, the senator that has the most seniority or has spent the most time in the Senate. Who gets to be the chairman of a specific committee of all the people on the committee? Well, almost always it is the senator which has the most seniority. In other words, the senator that has spent the most time on that specific committee. And so it goes, everything from the chairmanships on down to the places in which the senators sit, to simple things like the order in which the senators speak are all determined by seniority. And the seniority system was the #1 reason why the South had so much power in the Senate. Not only were the Southern senators incredibly talented and incredibly united, but they had also been in the Senate the longest. The seniority system is incredibly important to understanding how the Senate functions, and by this point in the 1950s, it had been around for over 100 years, and it was hardly ever not followed. And now that the South was in power and their power depended almost entirely on the seniority system, it was really important to Southern senators that the seniority system was never ever undermined. But the thing is, Johnson needed to undermine it, and he needed to undermine it a lot. See, Lyndon Johnson wanted to run to be president one day, and to do this he needed both the liberal and the southern wings of the Democratic Party behind him. But up until this point, he had only curried favor and made friendships with the southern bloc of the Democratic Party. But now he was going to be in the public eye a lot because he was the leader of the Democratic Party in the Senate. But if he was seen by the public as being just another Southern senator, his presidential prospects were non-existent. But of course, the two wings of the party absolutely hated each other, and if he was seen as helping the liberals by the Southerners, he was completely fried as well. But even if he could figure out a way to forge alliances with the other wing of his party, he simply had no authority with which to do it. As I explained earlier, all the power and authority in the Senate rests on the seniority system, and Johnson didn't even have any seniority, so the fact that he was Democratic Party leader gave him some minor authority over certain things, but in terms of appointing people to certain positions, moving legislation through the Senate, he had no authority over any of that. So even if he wanted to, there was no favors, there was nothing he could offer the liberal Northern senators in the Democratic Party. So this was Johnson's challenge. He needed to get an immense amount of power in the Senate despite having no seniority himself. And he needed to use that power to gain influence across both sides of a political divide without annoying anyone important on either side. Now, newly elected senators and other party leaders without seniority had tried for decades to increase their power within the Senate, but every single attempt had failed. Everyone, even the most talented politicians, had completely resigned themselves to the fact that the only way to get power in the Senate was to just stay there for long enough. And so for Johnson to do the impossible, he was going to have to move very carefully. Okay, so the first move Johnson made was to create a little bit of panic. In the past year, Dwight D. Eisenhower had been elected president as a Republican. This didn't come as a surprise to anyone because, he was the general in charge of the army in World War II and probably one of the most popular people in America. But the Democratic Party leadership believed that the massive popularity that Eisenhower had did not extend to the rest of the Republican Party. So the way they saw things, the Republican Party managed to kind of ride Eisenhower's coattails to get majorities in the Senate and the House. But it wasn't going to last very long because there wasn't any baseline increase in the popularity of the Republican Party. And so they thought that, once people got more used to Eisenhower, once Eisenhower fever died down a little bit, the Democrats would come back into power very quickly, and they were very calm about this whole situation, and that is exactly the calmness that Lyndon Johnson wanted to attack. First, he got his aide George Reedy to publish these memos detailing how the Republican Party was going to use their newfound majority to go out on an all-out offensive against the Democratic Party's baseline popularity. He explained that senior Republicans were going to make moves to stack committees where Democratic defenses were the weakest. In particular, he claimed that Senators Taft, Langer, Ferguson, and Noland, in an unprecedented move, were all going to go to the Foreign Relations Committee at the same time. There, led by then Republican Party leader Taft, they were going to try and discredit the Democratic foreign policy of the past 10 years. They were going to bring up things like the Marshall Plan, the handling of the Korean War, and the Yalta Accords, which was this agreement between Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin about what was going to happen to Eastern Europe after the war. And so Johnson argued through this memo that the Republicans were going to have this very concentrated and very public attack on Democratic policy there. And then he went on to explain that for the 2 open vacancies on the Foreign Relations Committee, he needed to install people that were very sturdy under attack and also knew a lot about foreign relations. So not necessarily the most senior senators that could take that position, but perhaps the people who were most qualified for the job. So the Southern Democratic leadership was not entirely convinced by Johnson's arguments. As I explained before, the seniority system was very important to them. They wanted to preserve it at all costs. But they still were slightly concerned about this whole Republican attack theory. So they decided to give Johnson some small concessions. And after a lot of negotiating, this is the agreement that they came to. Let's say 2 senators want the same open spot on a committee, and one of them was more senior than the other. In the past, the spot would just go without any discussion to the more senior senator. However, Johnson was now allowed to place a less senior senator there if the more senior senator already had another spot on another committee, and the senior senator agreed to let his position go, and the Democratic Party leadership also agreed to the change. And Johnson would have to make sure that all of these conditions were satisfied for every single move that he wanted to make. So after all this work, Johnson was handed a very restrictive and complicated set of constraints. I don't think anyone really expected him to accomplish very much with them, but they did not see what was coming. So Johnson got to work first on the Foreign Relations Committee. His picks were Hubert Humphrey and Mike Mansfield for the 2 open seats, both of whom were from the liberal northern wing of the Democratic Party, so perfectly in line with Johnson's plans. Unfortunately, there were 4 other people that also wanted the positions that were more senior. In order to follow the agreement Johnson made with the party leadership, he would have to get every single one of them to back down. And so Johnson got on the phone and started talking to them. Now, one thing I should say about Johnson is that he was an incredibly good salesman. Historian Robert Caro calls him the greatest one-on-one salesman who ever lived. In fact, historians even have a name for his sales tactic. They call it the treatment. He would just get up in your face for like 2 hours, 3 hours, 5 hours, and he would just talk nonstop. And, sometimes he would tell you stories from Texas. Sometimes he would try to sell you on some kind of idealistic political vision. If you were more powerful than him, he would just start to flatter you, just the most saccharine, intolerable kind of flattery. And if you were less powerful than him, he would just straight up start, threatening you. And Johnson used his sales tactics on all 4 of the senior senators. He sold them on the same points, basically. This idea that, the Republicans were attacking and these people needed to step aside and let more qualified people take the positions. And it worked on 3 of the senators. However, the toughest and most senior senator, Magnuson, did not back down. And Johnson was getting desperate. Then he had an idea. The breakdown of the Senate in 1953 was 48 Republicans, 47 Democrats, and 1 independent, a senator named Wayne Morse. The 1 independent senator was really annoying to the Republicans because committees back then had an odd number of members. The majority party always got 1 more vote than the minority party. But the issue was that wherever the independent senator went, whatever committee the independent senator went on, there would be an even number of Republicans and Democrats, and the Republicans did not like that. And Johnson saw an opportunity in this. He reached across the aisle to Republican Party leader Robert Taft and hammered out an agreement. And once again, at the end of some very intense negotiations, the Republicans got something that they wanted, namely, any committee that Wayne Morse, the independent senator, would sit on, the Republicans were granted 1 extra seat. And of course, the Republican leadership was very happy with this, and in return, what Johnson asked for was that the size of the Appropriations Committee be enlarged. So there should be 1 additional Republican seat as well as 1 additional Democratic seat, and the Republican leadership did not have a problem with this. Now, the Appropriations Committee in the Senate is pretty much the most powerful committee. It's the one that decides which proposals will get funding. And so now, when Johnson went back to Warren Magnuson, he was able to offer him a seat, a newly minted seat on the Appropriations Committee. And Warren Magnuson was happy with this. He was able to relinquish his claim to the seat on Foreign Relations so he could get a seat on Appropriations, thus clearing the way for Johnson to put Humphrey and Mansfield in the 2 open seats on the Foreign Relations Committee. And so this is really good for Johnson. He was able to get 2 liberal Northern Democratic senators really good committee assignments that they wanted without annoying any of the Southern Democrats. But on the other hand, that's a lot of work for just 2 assignments. It doesn't really seem like Johnson's power base is expanding very much. But Johnson definitely had more tricks up his sleeve. You see, while Mansfield, who had just newly been elected to the Senate, was eventually allowed to just take his seat on Foreign Relations, Humphrey did not get such a simple deal. When Johnson called Humphrey, he told him that he could have a spot on Foreign Relations, something that Humphrey desperately wanted, but to do this, he would have to give up his seats on both agriculture and labor. Now, this was a really tough sell. Humphrey really wanted that seat on Foreign Relations, but he was a senator from Minnesota, a farming state. But Johnson, the ever-talented salesman, persisted. He pushed Humphrey, telling him that his expertise as, one of the Senate's premier internationalists was needed on foreign relations now more than ever. He told Humphrey that foreign relations was the way to make a name for himself nationally. And eventually, slowly, Humphrey relented, and he gave up his positions on agriculture and labor to take a spot on foreign relations. So you see, Johnson had to work very hard to get 2 people where he wanted, but once he had this, he was able to turn it into 2 people where he wanted, plus 2 open spots. And once he had those 2 open spots, he was able to use his tactic again. Earl Clements of Kentucky, another farming state, wanted to be on agriculture real bad. So Johnson offered him the same deal. He offered him a position on agriculture as long as he gave up his seats in both the Public Works and the Rules Committee. And now all of a sudden, he had 3 people where he wanted, plus 3 open spots. And so it went on and on and on. You see, he very carefully and painstakingly made the first move, but what no one was able to predict was that first move was actually designed to be a wedge to drive the whole Senate apart. All of a sudden, dozens of people were moving around. One of his main goals was to make sure that all 6 of the newly elected Democratic senators got great appointments. Senator Mansfield, as I mentioned already, got to be on foreign relations. Senators Jackson and Kennedy got to be on government operations. Senator Symington, who was a former Secretary of the Air Force and therefore desperately wanted to be on something Army-related, now got to be on the Armed Services Committee, something that would not have been possible while the seniority rule was enforced. Another of Johnson's goals was to get some really, really good appointments for Southern senators too, and he planned out his chess so perfectly that they all did. For instance, Senator Johnston of South Carolina got a spot on the Judiciary Committee after leaving the DC Committee, and Senator Smathers of Florida got to leave the Post Office Committee to be on Interstate and Foreign Commerce. And what is amazing about all of these moves, and I've only shared a very small proportion of them with you, is that every single one of them had to be sold painstakingly, one by one to each senator. And so everyone had to be convinced that what they were doing was in their best interest, while Johnson was simultaneously serving his interest. And because each move was sold one by one, no one but Johnson was seeing the big picture. And the big picture was that slowly but surely, Northerners were being snuck onto more and more important committees, giving them greater and greater representation in the United States Senate. I also definitely should mention that despite all of the movements that were suddenly happening, all of the movements that were happening for the first time in like 100 years, Johnson made sure that none of his enemies got anything, that none of his enemies got any of the committee appointments that they wanted. And now Johnson, out of nowhere, out of just 2 weeks of painstaking, calculated effort and no sleep whatsoever, had become one of the most powerful senators in United States history. He now had people all over the Senate that owed everything to him. He had a guy on appropriations, a guy on defense, a guy on foreign relations. All 6 of the freshman senators who had just come in would have gotten nothing if it were not for Johnson's efforts. And these movements were so instrumental to what came in the decades after. Now there's so much more that I could say, but this video is already too long, so I'm just gonna have to leave it at that. I hope you guys really, really enjoyed the video. It took a lot of research, and if you like this kind of content, don't forget to leave a comment and subscribe. Peace.